One form of electropollution is what we call radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation. And this includes radiation from cell phones, cordless telephones, Wi-Fi devices such as your internet router, laptop, personal computer, baby monitor, and of course radiation that we are exposed to from smart meters that are being installed in every neighborhood. Now, if someone tells you that the levels of radiation in your environment are safe because they are within US and Canadian standards, I want you to show them this. You're looking at international RF protection guidelines for general population exposure. And you will notice that the US and Canadian guideline is at least 100 times higher than what you get from countries like Russia, China, Poland, Italy, Switzerland, and 10,000 times higher than guidelines you get in Austria, and up to 3.5 million times higher than what independent scientists recommend. So the question is this: why are other countries adopting stronger guidelines? And why do the US and Canada have the weakest RF exposure standards in the whole world? Have Americans and Canadians developed some kind of superhuman power that makes us immune to higher levels of radiation when compared to other people? I don't think so. So the next few minutes I will cover why these standards are so different worldwide, and more importantly, I will show you easy and convenient ways that you can protect yourself and your family against dangerous levels of radiation. But first, to begin, let's get some basic background understanding of what we're talking about. And I'll do this by asking you a question. What do radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet light, X-rays, and gamma rays all have in common? And the answer is that they are all part of what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the next question is, what makes them so different from each other? For example, what's the difference between the radiation from radio waves, which of course allow you to listen to your favorite music station, and the radiation from microwaves? And the simple answer is wavelength and frequency. Radio waves are long waves that have a low frequency. Microwaves are shorter waves with a higher frequency than radio waves. And as we keep moving up the electromagnetic spectrum, the waves keep getting shorter and the frequencies higher. The spectrum I'll be discussing in this lecture are man-made microwaves. And that's the range of frequencies that cell phones, Wi-Fi, and smart meters emit, along of course with your microwave ovens. In fact, microwave ovens and most cordless phones operate in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, which is the same as that used by your Wi-Fi wireless network. And that's why a microwave oven can cause interference with your network, even slowing down your connection. In a regular household, there's just so much congestion at 2.4 gigahertz that your Wi-Fi is operating at 5 gigahertz, just to avoid traffic and interference from the other waves in your home. And the scary thing is that people don't see, and most people don't feel, all of this radiation that is surrounding and penetrating them 24/7. In fact, only a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum can be seen by the naked eye, and that's visible light. And the rest, we don't see it. And there lies a challenge. We love the convenience of all of our appliances, we keep them on all the time, we're getting zapped to the point that there's congestion in our home, yet we don't see any of the dangers. Meanwhile, it is well understood that we absorb all waves of the electromagnetic spectrum, some more so than others. But it's not all bad, quite the contrary. Some wavelengths are actually therapeutic. For example, far infrared saunas are one of the greatest tools for detoxification used internationally by some of the top health institutes. That's because infrared is good. It's compatible with the human body. And we all understand the benefits of getting enough natural light, including UVB light that we absorb, allowing our body to produce vitamin D, which in turn helps to properly regulate our genes. We cannot see infrared or UVB radiation with our eyes, yet our body absorbs all of these waves in a very natural way. And this can be healthy and therapeutic. But on the other hand, exposure to man-made microwaves are not compatible with our biology, and they are damaging to the human body. But before we dive into the science that has led countries around the world to adopt very strict regulations, I want to make sure that you understand once and for all that exposure to all radiation affects us, for better or worse. And that's because, fundamentally, we are first and foremost electrical beings ourselves. And that's right, and it's something that most people don't think about or forget very often, but it's a simple foundation of all life on Earth. We are electrical beings. After all, think about this. We get diagnosed electrically all the time. We have electrocardiograms to measure the activity of our heart. We test the electric activity of our brains. If we run a marathon or suffer from food poisoning, we are quickly told to consume what? Electrolytes, otherwise we could die. And all of the cells that make up our body rely on their own little frequencies to keep us alive. Now hold on to your seat because I'm about to tell you that you even emit radiation from your body. That's right, humans emit electromagnetic waves in the infrared waveband. And of course, even the Earth has its natural magnetic field that is compatible with the human body. So yes, not only are we surrounded by, but we are also made up of natural electric frequencies. And any disruption to our cells' natural frequencies, such as that caused from what is now being called electropollution, is cause for major concern. You see, the human body is quite transparent to microwave emissions. A study was conducted in Sri Lanka to show just how much RF radiation the population absorbs. And they tested absorption through some of the most vital organs, the eyes, the testes, the brain, the kidneys. And the researchers were alarmed that at certain frequencies, there was an increase in absorption towards the interior of the organs. And this particularly happened with the eyes and the testes. Now, this study was conducted in 2006, before we even had 4G or even 3G. And so the researchers concluded the following, and I'll quote from the study itself. They said, when the 3G mobile communication systems become operational in the very near future, the public would be exposed to more microwaves and the exposure levels would go up. The eye and testes would be exposed to higher frequencies, such as 3,500 megahertz and beyond. As such, hotspots would be created close to the center of the eye and the testes. This certainly should be of public concern. As the demand for telephone and broadband internet access increases, the wireless network providers would install more base stations, with the result that the strength of the field exposed to by the public will go up, and with that, the specific absorption rates will go up. Hence, it is advisable to carry out specific absorption rate evaluations periodically to check and maintain specific absorption rates at acceptable levels for public safety. And end of quote. Essentially, that was just a reminder of the fact that we are exposed to an amount of RF radiation that is increasing at an exponential rate. Our vital organs absorb all of these frequencies, and somehow, some way, our body has to figure out how to handle this. So now is a great time to begin explaining why governments around the world have taken a strong precautionary approach to protect their citizens, recognizing the dangers of electropollution and setting radiation exposure limits that are 100 to thousands of times lower than Canadian and US guidelines. And why they've done this is very simple. It's a one-word answer. Science. That's right. They use science to make decisions. Now let's take a look at charts that summarize some of these findings. And here we are specifically looking at the biological effects of low-intensity radiofrequency radiation exposure, such as that emitted from smart meters and Wi-Fi. Now I'm not going to show you all the charts and go through all the findings, but I'll just highlight a few of these for you. Here you see that chronic exposure to a power density of 0.00034 microwatts per centimeter squared resulted in significantly reduced sperm count. To put things into context, 0.00034 microwatts per centimeter squared is almost 3 million times lower than the US and Canadian guideline, which is 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. And here we have that exposure to 0.006 to 0.01 microwatts per centimeter squared resulted in an increase in stress hormones while dopamine levels decreased. Here, exposure at 8.75 microwatts per centimeter squared for 2 to 12 hours caused DNA breaks in leukemia cells. At 50 microwatts, we see a decrease in REM sleep. At 60 microwatts, we see that pulsed radiofrequency radiation affects immune function in white blood cells. At 92.5, we see genetic changes in human white blood cells. And for all of you men and women out there who are concerned about your testosterone levels, after just 6 hours of exposure of 100 microwatts, we see a 24.3% drop in testosterone. Another study here shows us that at 500 microwatts per centimeter squared, which is very high but still only 50% of the US and Canadian guideline, we see again a 24.6% drop in testosterone and a 23.2% drop in insulin after just 12 hours of pulsed radiofrequency radiation exposure. And the studies go on to show brain and neurological disorders, infertility, DNA damage, cardiovascular effects, decreased immune function, and cancer. You can find all of these charts along with a 1,800-page report prepared by scientists, doctors, and other experts at bioinitiative.org. And particularly at risk are, of course, our children. Our children are the first generation ever to be exposed to high levels of microwave radiation 24/7. They are guinea pigs. After all, they are being exposed to more radiation than has ever been researched. And this is why in 2013, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, wrote a letter to the FCC urging the FCC to change its radiofrequency radiation standards to reflect the current scientific evidence on the dangers of wireless technology. The American Association of Pediatrics is a non-profit professional organization that consists of 60,000 primary care pediatricians, pediatric medical subspecialists, and pediatric surgical specialists dedicated to the health, safety, and well-being of infants, children, adolescents, and young adults. And so the president of this organization wrote to the FCC, and I'll quote from the letter. He said, "Children are not little adults and are disproportionately impacted by all environmental exposures, including cell phone radiation. Current FCC standards do not account for the unique vulnerability and use patterns specific to pregnant women and children. It is essential that any new standard for cell phones or other wireless devices be based on protecting the youngest and most vulnerable populations to ensure they are safeguarded throughout their lifetimes." End of quote. Now let me tell you about the FCC. FCC stands for the Federal Communications Commission, and in 1996 the Telecommunications Act gave the FCC total power over the issue of environmental health and radiofrequency radiation exposure. So to this day, the FCC holds the responsibility for setting the RF radiation guidelines in the USA. The FCC's current RF radiation exposure guidelines are 3.5 million times higher than recommendations by independent researchers. And that's to be expected for several reasons. And the first reason is that the FCC bases its standards on 1996 information, most of which was derived from short-term studies conducted in the early 80s. That's right, the 80s, when Michael J. Fox had his Teen Wolf movies coming out. In his letter to the FCC, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics reminds us that, and I'll quote again, "The FCC has not assessed the standard for cell phone radiation since 1996. Approximately 44 million people had mobile phones when the standard was set. Today, there are more than 300 million mobile phones in use in the United States." End of quote. And it gets worse. The US government has not conducted a single study on the biological effect of wireless technology since the 1990s. There is no safety testing before digital devices and electronics hit the market. This includes all your kids' games. And remember that the newer technologies that we are using today, such as iPads, iPhones, or 4G networks, well, they've only been around for 5 years. Let me put it this way. Let's think of an imaginary child, let's say a little 8-year-old boy, and let's call him Tommy. Let me give you a day in Tommy's life. Tommy goes to sleep and wakes up in a home where he is exposed to microwaves from Wi-Fi, from cordless phones that pulse all day even when not in use, from smart meters that also pulse all day long, and then Tommy is driven to school in a car that features Bluetooth technology. And then Tommy spends his day in a school that is currently debating whether or not to install a Wi-Fi network. At lunchtime, Tommy realizes, oh shoot, he forgot to grab his lunchbox from the kitchen counter. So he calls his mom or his dad, on his cell phone of course, to let one of them know that they should probably bring him his lunch. Then Tommy comes home, has dinner, and after dinner, guess what he's doing? He's playing on a wireless Nintendo or Xbox video game. This child is exposed to microwaves, over microwaves, over microwaves all day long, either directly or indirectly from his environment. And, as the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics wrote, a child is not just a small-sized adult. A child is still developing and a lot more vulnerable to the biological effects of electrical magnetic fields. And here is a simple illustration of this fact. Remember how I explained that we absorb all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum? Here you can see how children absorb microwaves through their entire brain. And again, these are microwaves, same as what they are exposed to with electronic games they play, Wi-Fi and smart meters they are exposed to, 4G networks and so forth, all of which we never tested. We have science to indicate we should take a precautionary approach, especially for our children. And that doesn't mean we should stop advancements of technology. Far from it. We just want to learn more and improve technology to better serve us as opposed to causing harm. So in short, the first reason that the FCC guidelines are 3.5 million times higher than recommendations by independent scientists is that it's chosen to turn a blind eye to any scientific data since the 90s. And this has appalled many scientists, including some scientists at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, where they award a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. And there is a press release from the Karolinska Institute's Department of Neuroscience that is worth reading, and I'll go through parts of it with you. So, they recommend that lower limits be established for electromagnetic fields and wireless exposures based on scientific studies reporting health impacts at much lower exposure levels. Many researchers now believe the existing safety limits are inadequate to protect public health because they do not consider prolonged exposure to lower emission levels that are now widespread. End of quote. And so this press release goes on to say that the current US and ICN IRP standards for radio frequency and microwave radiation from wireless technologies are, and I'll quote again, entirely inadequate, and that billions of people around the world are at risk for cancer, neurological disease, and reproductive and developmental impairments. And the press release continues to warn us that the smart grid concept could require every home to have a wireless electric and gas meter in place of their existing meters. If implemented, it will greatly increase the intensity of new wireless emissions in homes, schools, and every other building that uses electricity and gas. End of quote. And this means that they are obviously against smart meters, stating that the speed of the rollouts of these wireless technologies has outpaced both health studies and calls for more restrictive public safety limits. And that again was the press release written from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm and written by scientists who actually study radio frequency radiation from wireless technologies. Now let's get back to talking about the FCC and why they haven't informed and educated the public or changed their guidelines to a safer level. First, you have to understand that the FCC is not a safety or health agency. Far from it. The FCC is actually a licensing and engineering group. They are a bunch of engineers that don't really care about biological effects. So what do they care about? Well, the FCC's official mission statement is to make available, as far as possible, wire and radio communication services at reasonable charges. And, under its first goal, the FCC writes that regulatory policies must promote technological neutrality, competition, investment, and innovation to ensure that broadband service providers have sufficient incentives to develop and offer such products and services. In other words, the FCC's number one goal is to improve profits for broadband service providers. And the FCC has 6 official goals, none of which have to do with your health. And these people that are constantly working for the telecommunications industry are supposed to police themselves. That's like the oil companies being in charge of setting environmental policies. This is what we call conflicts of interest. And here is another example. The Canadian Medical Association Journal reported conflicts of interest within the panel in charge of recommending radio frequency exposure limits. The Royal Society of Canada was in charge of electing this panel, and to defend itself, claimed that it is difficult to identify researchers without industry ties. So if you do not understand that in North America, corporations have the power to do as they please, and there is a long history of this, then you need to get your head out from under the sand, because by now you should have a clear understanding as to why the US and Canadian RF exposure guidelines are so much higher than they should be, especially if we were to base ourselves on scientific evidence and look towards the good of humanity instead of profits. And now let's move on to the next part of my lecture that I jokingly call Why You Should Keep Your Big Mouth Shut. Industries often rely on us, the general public, to spread their misinformation. They control the media to cause confusion, to move our attention away from where it should be, and to do this they rely on the fact that most of us are not good consumers of scientific information, and that we as a population often do not understand how to separate real science from checkbook science, which is not a term for industry marketing. And chances are you've participated in this without realizing it. Chances are that at some point you have helped to spread disinformation. And let me give you a basic example. Let's say that a headline appears in the media and it states something such as, "Study, cell phones don't increase brain tumor." And so you read the headline thinking that since it's been published and sounds official, it must carry some weight. But if you don't read the actual scientific study that this headline was based on, and especially if you have no background in cancer research, you will be fooled. And here's why. Their headline could be based on a study that only looked at its participants for a few years. And if you know anything about cancer, you will know that most cancers represent a monumental breakdown of the immune system, and that there are 3 phases of cancer, from initiation to promotion and progression. And this all can take several decades to develop. Decades, not a few years. Now, this would be explained in the study, but none of that is explained in the headline you read, of course. And this is one way that the tobacco industry was able to deny for 4 decades that tobacco increases your risk for cancer. And I mentioned the tobacco example because it's very similar to what we're dealing with today with the telecommunications industry. But today we know the facts on cigarette smoking. The moment that you smoke 1 cigarette, there are negative biological effects that occur in your body. 1 cigarette. Does this mean it will cause cancer? No. It just means that you did something to weaken your immune system in that particular moment. And if you keep doing this over time, usually decades, your immune system will be too weak to protect you from diseases such as cancer. So just 1 cigarette is bad for you. 1 meal high in saturated animal fat also has immediate consequences. For example, it takes many hours for your arteries to properly dilate after consuming such a bad meal. Does this mean that it will lead to cardiovascular disease? Well, if you keep doing that to yourself, it will. But the point is that just 1 unhealthy meal has an immediate negative effect. Just 1 cigarette has an immediate negative effect. And just 1 phone call on a cell phone has immediate biological effects. And whether we develop cancer years from now has to do with how many punches our immune system can take over time. But if you look at the tobacco industry example, those companies got away with it for decades. They even had government scientists telling the public that cigarettes are good for you. And they were able to do this because of the public's lack of education and because of our desire to have quick answers. We are attracted to headlines that say that something causes or something doesn't cause cancer. We just want the quick answer. And then something worse happens. We repeat the headline to other people. And then it's repeated so often that we stop listening to legitimate ethical scientists from the most respected institutions around the world. We just want the quick headline. So please, learn to do better research. Rise above the manipulation. Understand once and for all that most chronic diseases are due to cumulative damage and environmental exposure over long periods of time. And remember that you can choose not to smoke that cigarette. You can choose not to have that unhealthy meal. But today, you cannot choose not to be exposed to levels of radiation that has scientists around the world worried to the point that they are calling electropollution one of the biggest environmental challenges of our time. Even the World Health Organization, that has been severely criticized for moving so slowly on this issue, has recently added radiofrequency radiation to their list of possible carcinogens. The good news is that we are getting there. Public consciousness is rising. And the irony is that this is thanks to all the new technologies that we have available today, such as the internet, that allow us to communicate so well and to educate and empower people in the world to better protect themselves and the environment. So do I really mean that you should keep your big mouth shut? No, I don't. What I mean is that you should make sure that you understand the full context of the issues before blindly trusting headlines and repeating them to others. Because those headlines are not intended to fool the neuroscience department at the Karolinska Institute. They are not intended to fool the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And they are certainly not intended to fool microwave radiation experts that have spent decades learning about the dangers of radio frequencies. No, the deceptive headlines are just meant to fool us. And speaking of fooling us, I'll give you one more quick example from here in Montreal. And I'll use this as a good microcosm of what goes on in the whole world. So here in Montreal, we have a so-called scientist who is a very popular figure in the media. In fact, he's known as the guy that helps interpret science for the public, and people trust him. The problem is that they don't realize that his program is funded by very big industries, including the chemical companies that he has a track record of defending. And his department recently received over $5 million from a very wealthy local businessman that has a stake in the telecommunications industry. And these two men formed a website that is intended to discredit scientists around the world that have expressed concern over electropollution. And this website's official position is that there is absolutely zero cause for concern whatsoever. And you can read on the front page of their website, there are no proven health effects from EMFs that is within existing safety guidelines. Okay, but tell me, which safety guidelines are they referring to? Because we know that outside of Canada and the US, the guidelines are a lot more stringent. And also, we are rolling out new technologies faster than any guideline can be changed. So, an educated public can easily understand that websites such as this have one main goal. And that is to take attention away from what we should really be talking about as a community. The conversation they want us to have is, should we or shouldn't we attempt to lower exposure levels? But the conversation that we should be having is, how do we reduce our exposure to protect ourselves and our children from being guinea pigs? And we've been through this before. In our history, every time scientific evidence started to surface that something was making us sick, whether it was lead in paint, asbestos, tobacco, or anything else, the first reaction from industry has always been to deny, and spend lots of money to persuade the public otherwise, regardless of scientists telling us the truth. But eventually the evidence becomes so insurmountable and the public gets better educated and change is implemented. The problem, however, is that a lot of people get hurt in this time lapse. And that is why the Bioinitiative report is recommending a precautionary approach so that we may keep using the technologies that we love, but in a way that doesn't harm us. This report is 1,800 pages and summarizes several thousands of studies conducted on EMFs, and it's put together by a collection of scientists, doctors, and other experts from all around the world. Here are just a few of them. And so now we've reached the end of this lecture, where I'm about to leave you with some tips that you can easily implement to help you reduce radio frequency exposure within your own home and office space. And my goal is to help you reduce your exposure as much as possible to get as close as you can to the recommendations given by the Bioinitiative report. So, tip number 1. It has to do with the cordless telephones in your home. We call these digitally enhanced cordless telephones. Do not use these. Unlike cell phones, cordless phones do not power down when not in use. So you are essentially blasting your home with microwaves all the time. And if you use a cordless phone with your head positioned between the phone and the base station, the microwaves go directly through your head. So you would be wise to replace all of your cordless telephones with corded ones. But if you insist on keeping a cordless phone, get the older 900 megahertz analog versions because they actually power down when not in use compared to the newer ones which act like mini cell phone towers in your own home. Tip number 2 is about cell phones. The good news is newer cell phones emit less radiation than older ones because those companies, they're not stupid. They've been working really hard to get those levels lower and lower and lower as the public consciousness is getting higher, higher, and higher. So here's what you have to do with your cell phone. At night, when you go to sleep, make sure your cell phone is on airplane mode. Every smartphone has airplane mode. And you will still be able to use your cell phone as an alarm clock. And as soon as you disable airplane mode in the morning, you will receive all the text messages or voicemail that you had missed. And the reason that I start by telling you about airplane mode is because I know that most people go to sleep at night with their phone right next to their bed. And we have enough scientific research, sleep research, to tell us that getting a good night's sleep is probably the most important thing you can do for your health. And you don't want to sacrifice your sleep by getting these pulses of radiation all through the night. And when talking on your cell phone, don't use a Bluetooth device. That's only going to make things worse, not going to help. But what you need to do, as much as possible, is use wired headsets or earphones. Never talk on the phone while in the car, because that's just going to magnify the radiation. Never keep your phone close to your body, such as in your pants pocket, because you don't want that for your genitals. And obviously, use your phone as little as possible. And again, if it's not in use and you don't need it for a while, put it on airplane mode. Now let's talk about Wi-Fi in the house. And I especially like this tip because it's very convenient and it actually increases your internet speed. So the tip is to get something called a power line adapter. And here's what you do. You connect one of these to your internet router. And then you connect others to any electrical outlet in your home. And instantly, you have a wired internet connection that utilizes the existing power lines in your walls. So let's say you wanted to have a computer with an internet connection in a room where you don't have any cables installed. And so you started using a wireless connection because you had to. But you haven't been satisfied with the speed of your connection, and having done some research, you're not comfortable with having Wi-Fi in your home. Well, here's what you do. You just plug one of these power line adapters into your wall where your computer is, and then plug your computer to the adapter using an Ethernet cable, and now you can enjoy faster download speeds and reduce your exposure to Wi-Fi. This technology is so easy and so convenient that most people who buy these adapters do so because they want to stream high-definition content and need a faster connection. Now, what if you still want to use some wireless devices in your home, but not all the time? Here's what you can do very conveniently. Get a router that has an on-off switch just for the Wi-Fi. This will allow you to use a wired connection for most of the day, and if there's a moment when you want to use your Wi-Fi, you just press the on button, use your Wi-Fi, and then turn it off easily by pressing that same button again. And, like the cell phone, it's good to turn off the Wi-Fi at night when you sleep. Of course, you can just go into the settings of any router to turn on and turn off Wi-Fi, but I find it easier to actually have a router with a physical button that you can press anytime. Now let's move on to smart meters. It's not a big secret by now that the power companies have been lying and at best manipulating the facts about how these smart meters work. One example is when power companies manipulate data when comparing radiation exposure from cell phone usage as opposed to smart meters, making it seem as if we get a lot more radiation from our cell phones. This is absolutely false and highly misleading because they neglect to factor in two key points. First of all, cell phone exposure is concentrated to the ear, while a smart meter equals full body exposure. Secondly, A smart meter is always on, whereas a cell phone is off for 99% of the time. So radiation expert Daniel Hirsch wrote a report where he properly adjusted for these two factors and came up with the conclusion that a smart meter produces 160 times more cumulative whole body exposure than a cell phone. Daniel Hirsch calls this smart meter rollout a large involuntary experiment on a large section of the population. He reminds us that we have to consider cumulative exposure producing a latent illness which takes decades to manifest itself. And Dr. Ronald Powell from Harvard writes that a single smart meter on a neighbor's home can produce RF power density levels shown to cause biological effects. So the simple tip is don't install a smart meter. Opt out. It's true that it is your legal right if you want to keep it, but it doesn't make it the right thing to do. Imagine if you live in a building with many floors and your condo is right over the basement where a bank of smart meters were installed. Where are your rights? Is it fair for your neighbors to be blasting your home with microwaves coming from their smart meter? This is why the Bioinitiative report recommends that if one tenant in a building refuses a smart meter, then all tenants must refuse a smart meter as well. Because as long as our technologies affect someone else's right to clean air, it is unethical to keep blasting our devices with disregard. So the conversation that you have with your neighbors should be how to peacefully find a way to coexist and limit exposure to radiation levels. The same way you wouldn't want someone to come into your home and blow smoke, you wouldn't want someone to pulse microwaves through your home all day long. But then again, you smell and see smoke, but you don't see the microwaves, which brings me up to the next tip. Buy an RF meter. These are radio frequency detectors. Let me tell you what I do with my clients. I hold an RF meter next to a wireless router that is off. My clients see that the numbers on the meter are pretty low. And then I turn on the Wi-Fi and bang, immediately the numbers on the meter shoot up and it's pulsing away. And then I turn off the Wi-Fi and the numbers on the meter shoot way back down. And I look at my clients' faces and their expression says it all. Holy crap, we're exposed to radiation. It's important for people to see this because seeing is believing. Furthermore, having an RF meter helps my clients make adjustments around their house and measure the reduction in radiation levels. They calculate safe distances from certain appliances, they test their kids' electronics, and even if they're looking to buy a house, it's a great way to check around the neighborhood to see what the radiation levels are in the environment. So I do highly recommend a good meter. And if you're watching this video directly from the community section of my website at marquitonutrition.com, just look below the video and you will find the meters that I have used effectively and recommend to my clients. Now my final tip is proper nutrition. A whole foods plant-based diet will help protect you from damage caused by radiation. Blue, green, and green algae are best known to help with radiation, and wheatgrass juice along with a diet rich in sprouts will provide you with the nutritional support required in today's environment. It's getting a lot more challenging out there and we need to really make sure that we're feeding our body with what we need to defend ourselves. And I'll leave you with one last thought. Don't wait for government to protect you. Don't wait for the telecommunications industry to protect you. It's up to you. It's up to me. And it's up to all of us to demand clean air and to take responsibility because we are accountable for our actions. Thank you.